My name is Matthew. I'm in my late 30s now. For most of my adult life, I was the kind of man people describe as steady, dependable, predictable in the best way. I built systems, schedules, and habits. I paid bills early. I showed up on time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make scenes. If you passed me on the street, you probably wouldn't remember me 5 minutes later. That's not self-pity. It's accuracy. I've always been easy to overlook. Even the people closest to me would say I was calm, reasonable, and low maintenance. The kind of man you assume will always be there because he always has been. And that assumption, that quiet reliability equals permanence, is where this story begins. This is not a story about rage. It's not about revenge, exposure, or winning some dramatic showdown. It's about something slower and harder to see. It's about how I treated my marriage like something guaranteed, until it was gone overnight, and how I assumed she would always stay, and built my life on that arrogance. For a long time, I thought silence was strength. I thought endurance was love. I believed that if I just stayed consistent, patient, and useful, everything would balance out on its own. I didn't think of myself as weak. I thought of myself as evolved, above conflict, above ego. What I didn't understand, what I'll be honest about here, is how invisibility grows when it's rewarded. How being the safe one slowly turns into being the background. And how the absence of conflict can hide the absence of respect. This story unfolds quietly. There's no single explosion, no villain monologue, no moment where someone throws a glass against a wall. Instead, there are small shifts, casual dismissals, unanswered questions, roles that get assigned without discussion, and one day, a realization that arrives fully formed, without drama. Something fundamental has already ended. What follows is the emotional journey of noticing too late, then choosing not to react loudly. It's about restraint turning into clarity, about silence becoming intentional, about preparation that looks like nothing from the outside, and about consequences that arrive not as punishment, but as physics. I'm not telling this story to make myself look heroic. I made real mistakes. I confused being needed with being valued. I outsourced my boundaries to hope, and for a long time, I benefited from avoiding hard truths. But I'm also not telling this to shame anyone else. This isn't an attack on marriage, or on women, or on love. It's a documentary-style account of how emotional dynamics actually shift when one person stops assuming and starts seeing. If you're listening to this, maybe you recognize pieces of yourself already. Maybe you've been the reliable one, the calm one, the one people lean on without checking whether you're still standing straight. So before we go any further, I want to ask you, gently, honestly, have you ever mistaken silence for stability in a relationship? To understand how everything unraveled, you have to understand who I was to other people, not who I thought I was. At work, I was the guy you went to when something quietly went wrong. Not emergencies, not crises that needed shouting. The slow problems. The ones hiding in spreadsheets, timelines, and overlooked details. I didn't advertise solutions. I just fixed things before they became visible. That made me valuable, but not memorable. People remembered the outcome, not the person who made it happen. In social settings, I was agreeable, not a doormat, but adaptable. I didn't dominate conversations. I listened. I remembered details others forgot. Birthdays, preferences, small stories people told once and assumed no one heard. That made it easy to keep around. Comfortable, predictable. In my marriage, I was the foundation. I handled logistics, finances, planning. If something needed thinking through calmly, it landed on me. If something needed emotional smoothing, I was there. I became a place where stress was dropped off and not picked back up. At first, that felt like a partnership, like trust. But foundations are rarely admired. They're assumed. When people talked about us, they talked about her energy, her creativity, her emotional intelligence. I didn't resent that. I was proud of it. I believed my role was to support the structure so she could shine. That belief became identity. I was the steady one, the reasonable one, the one who doesn't take things personally. And that last label stuck deeper than I realized. When decisions were made without me, it was because you're flexible. When my preferences were overridden, it was because you don't mind. When my absence from conversations went unnoticed, it was because Matthew's fine. No one meant harm, that's important. There was no malicious intent, just momentum. I rarely said no, not because I couldn't, but because it seemed unnecessary. I believed that love kept score in some invisible cosmic ledger. That consistency would be returned eventually. That sacrifice accumulated interest. What I didn't see was that I was training people how to treat me. I became the background constant, the safe variable, the thing that didn't need checking. And the more dependable I was, the less visible I became. There's a strange loneliness that comes with being trusted completely, but consulted rarely. You're not excluded, you're bypassed. Decisions just happen around you. At first, I thought that meant maturity, emotional security. I told myself that wanting recognition was ego, that needing reassurance was a weakness. I congratulated myself for being above it. But here's the truth I didn't want to admit. I liked being needed more than being known. Being needed gave me a role, a function, a reason to exist in the system. Being known required vulnerability and the possibility that what was known might be inconvenient. So I stayed useful, quietly indispensable, easily replaceable, but no one noticed yet. When people describe me from that period, they use words like Osud, good guy, and rock. No one says seen, no one says considered, no one says chosen, and I didn't ask them to. That's the part that matters most. I participated in my own invisibility. I mistook the absence of conflict for the presence of respect. I believed that as long as I was calm, things were stable. But stability without attention isn't stability. It's a neglect of good manners. Looking back, there were moments, small ones, where I could have shifted the trajectory, where I could have said, that matters to me, or I'm not okay with that, or even just, slow down. I didn't. Because the version of me everyone relied on didn't ask for space, didn't complicate things, didn't disrupt the flow. And once a role is assigned and accepted long enough, it becomes invisible when it disappears. At the time, I didn't know I was laying the groundwork for that disappearance. I thought I was building permanence. I was wrong. The first time it happened, I almost didn't register it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. There's no pain sharp enough to demand attention. Just a slight sting, easy to dismiss, easier to rationalize. We were having dinner with friends. Nothing special. A weeknight, casual conversation, plates half finished. Someone asked a question about a decision we'd made together. Something logistical, unimportant in the grand scheme. I started to answer, out of habit more than urgency. She cut in. Not aggressively, not rudely, just smoothly, like my sentence was an optional draft she was improving. She explained the decision differently than I would have. Not wrong, just as if I wasn't there, as if my version didn't matter enough to complete. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't react. The conversation moved on. Laughter followed. Glasses clinked. I smiled, nodded, let it pass. That moment lasted maybe 3 seconds. It would have been easy to forget, and for a while, I did. But something lodged itself in my chest. Not anger, not jealousy, confusion, a quiet sense of being edited out of my own life. Later that night, I replayed it, not obsessively, just enough to ask myself a question I'd never asked before. Was that new? I told myself it was nothing. She was tired, excited, trying to be helpful. I reminded myself of all the times I'd let conversations flow without asserting control. I prided myself on not needing the spotlight. So I did what I always did. I contextualized my discomfort until it dissolved. But that cut didn't heal. It just closed over. After that, it happened again. Slightly different setting, slightly different topic. Same pattern. I'd begin a thought and she'd finish it, or redirect it, or summarize it as if translating something clumsy. Always calmly, always socially acceptable. No one else flinched, so I told myself I shouldn't either. That's how normalization begins. Not with denial, but with comparison. If no one else sees a problem, maybe I'm imagining it. I didn't confront her, not because I was afraid, but because I couldn't articulate the injury without sounding petty. How do you explain that being gently overwritten hurts? That being consistently interrupted reshapes something inside you? So I stayed quiet, observant. And in that silence, something else became clear. These moments only happened to me. Not to others, not to friends, not to colleagues, just me. I started noticing patterns. Who was deferred to, whose opinions were expanded on, whose words were paraphrased instead of quoted. And I noticed how often my contributions were treated as raw material rather than finished thoughts. Still, I did nothing. Because acknowledging the cut would require acknowledging that the dynamic had shifted, and that would mean admitting that the marriage I thought was stable was changing shape without my consent. It's easier to ignore a small wound than to reevaluate an entire structure, so I adapted. I spoke less. I chose words more carefully. I waited for openings instead of creating them. And every time I did, the space I occupied got a little smaller. That first cut didn't hurt because it was cruel. It hurt because it revealed something I wasn't ready to see. I was no longer being met, I was being managed. And the worst part? I let it happen because it was easier than disrupting the image of harmony I'd spent years protecting. Once something happens twice, it stops feeling accidental. That's when the real danger begins, not in the act itself, but in how quickly the mind adjusts to it. The interruptions became patterns, not constant, not blatant. Just frequent enough to register and subtle enough to deny. A sentence redirected here, a decision reframed there. My preferences were acknowledged and then quietly overridden. And each time, I gave myself a reason to stay quiet. She didn't mean it like that. This isn't worth turning into an issue. I'm being too sensitive. I told myself that relationships require flexibility, and I was very good at bending. I framed my silence as maturity, as emotional intelligence. I convinced myself that choosing peace over ego was a virtue. But peace isn't the same as avoidance. I started to notice how often my role was to accommodate. Plans were made around what worked for her schedule, social commitments aligned with her energy levels. When conflicts arose, small ones, everyday ones, I was the one expected to de-escalate. "You're so calm," she'd say. "That's why this works." And I accepted that as praise, even as something inside me eroded. Because calm, in this context, didn't mean centered. It meant absorbent. I was expected to absorb tension, absorb inconvenience, absorb emotional overflow, and return stability. The problem with being endlessly accommodating is that it trains others to push a little further each time. The dismissals grew more casual, a joke at my expense that didn't quite land. A decision was announced instead of discussed. We talked about this when we hadn't. And when I hesitated, when I paused before agreeing, there was confusion, almost surprise. "You're okay with that, right?" It wasn't a question, it was a reminder of the role I'd been playing. I could feel myself shrinking in moments like that, not physically, but internally, as if asserting myself would break some unspoken contract. So I rationalized again. This is what long-term relationships look like. No one gets everything they want. This isn't disrespect, it's efficiency. But efficiency for one person often means erasure for the other. I stopped volunteering opinions unless asked. I let conversations move past me. I told myself I didn't need to be involved in everything to feel secure. But security built on silence is fragile. There were nights I lay awake replaying conversations, wondering when my voice had become optional, wondering how long it had been since I felt genuinely consulted instead of informed. Still, I said nothing, because saying something would require me to admit that I wasn't as unaffected as I pretended to be, that the calm exterior was doing more work than I acknowledged. And there was another truth I avoided. Confrontation would disrupt the stability I depended on, not emotionally, but structurally. Our life worked because I didn't resist. So I normalized the disrespect. I treated it like background noise, like a tax you pay for harmony. I convinced myself that love meant endurance, not reciprocity. But endurance without acknowledgement doesn't build closeness, it builds distance. Slowly, I stopped expecting to be heard, and once expectations disappear, people rarely notice their absence. That's how roles calcify. That's how silence becomes standard. And by the time you realize you're being diminished, you've already taught everyone, including yourself, that this is who you are. Roles don't get assigned in conversations. They get assigned in patterns. By the time I became aware of mine, it was already well established. I was the reliable one, the rational one, the man who could be counted on to handle things without needing attention or reassurance. That role came with expectations. I was expected to understand without being told, to adapt without being asked, to support without needing support in return. When something needed doing, it was assumed I would do it. When something needed fixing, it was assumed I would fix it. And when something needed to change, it was assumed I would adjust. The unspoken agreement was simple. I would provide stability, and in exchange, I would not disrupt the emotional flow. I wouldn't bring up discomfort. I wouldn't complicate things with feelings that couldn't be easily resolved. I had become useful, not essential. There's a difference. Essential people are consulted. Useful people are deployed. I started to see it in the language. Can you handle this? Instead of, what do you think? Just take care of it, instead of, let's decide together. I was no longer part of the deliberation. I was the execution. At first, that felt efficient. I told myself it freed us from unnecessary friction. But over time, it became clear that I wasn't being spared stress. I was being spared significance. And the more I fulfilled the role without resistance, the more entrenched it became. What disturbed me wasn't that she relied on me, it was that she no longer checked in with me. My agreement was assumed, my consent is implied, my presence is taken for granted. I realized one evening, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, that she was telling me about a major decision she'd already made, not asking, informing. She spoke confidently, casually, as if my role was to absorb the update and move forward. I nodded, asked a logistical question, offered a solution, and she relaxed. That reaction told me everything. She wasn't worried about my feelings, she was worried about friction, and once she saw there would be none, the moment passed. I sat there afterward, long after the conversation ended, realizing something that unsettled me more than anger would have. This was working exactly as designed, not by her alone, by both of us. I had trained her, and everyone else, on what to expect from me. No pushback, no resistance, no disruption, just calm compliance wrapped in responsibility. And now, that was the only version of me that fit. The role was clear, reliable, useful, invisible. The problem with being invisible is that when you finally move, it shocks everyone. But at this stage, I wasn't moving yet. I was still playing the part, because stepping out of it would require something I hadn't practiced in years, choosing myself without justification. And I wasn't ready for that yet. But something had begun to shift, not outwardly, internally. I stopped seeing the role as neutral. I stopped believing it was harmless. I began to understand that roles, once assigned, don't protect relationships. They freeze them. And frozen systems don't adapt, they fracture. I didn't confront her. I didn't announce a change. I didn't demand recognition. I did something quieter. I started paying attention to what was said, to what wasn't, to when my presence mattered and when it didn't. That awareness didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. And clarity is dangerous to systems built on assumptions. There wasn't an argument, no raised voices, no dramatic revelation, just a moment so ordinary that I almost missed it. It was a Sunday morning, light coming through the kitchen window at an angle that only happens in early spring. Coffee is cooling on the counter, the quiet kind of day that's supposed to feel safe. She was talking, not to me, at me, running through plans she'd made for the coming months. Travel, commitments, adjustments to routines that affected both of us. I listened, nodded, asked practical questions, and then she said something small, a single sentence, casual, unconsidered. We'll figure out how you fit into that. She didn't mean it cruelly, she meant it efficiently. That sentence landed differently than all the others, because it clarified something I'd been circling for months without naming. I was no longer a participant in my own life. I was an accessory to a plan already in motion. I looked at her in that moment and realized she wasn't checking whether I agreed. She was checking whether I would adapt, and I would have, I always had. But something inside me didn't move this time. Not anger, not sadness, stillness. I saw the pattern in full for the first time, not as isolated moments, but as a system. A system where my silence was interpreted as consent, and my consistency was mistaken for infinite capacity. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't argue. I let the conversation finish naturally. But internally, something detached. It felt like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing the whole composition. The colors didn't change, but their meaning did. I realized that I had been managing my own erasure in the name of peace. That the version of love I was practicing required me to be smaller than I actually was. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The rest of the day passed normally. We did errands. We talked about nothing important. From the outside, nothing shifted. But internally, a boundary appeared, not spoken, but real. I stopped assuming. I stopped filling in gaps. I stopped smoothing edges preemptively. Not out of spite, out of accuracy. That night, I lay awake and did something I hadn't done in years. I asked myself what I wanted, without immediately calculating how it would affect someone else. The answer didn't come right away, but the question stayed. And that was the shift. Not a decision, not a plan, Just the end of automatic compliance, the beginning of choice. Silence feels different when it's no longer automatic. Before, my quietness had been reflexive, an instinct to maintain balance, to prevent friction before it formed. I spoke less because I felt responsible, because I believed harmony depended on my absorbing the weight. After that morning, silence became intentional. I still listened. I still responded calmly, but I stopped filling the space. I stopped translating her thoughts into solutions. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been expressed. From the outside, nothing changed. If anything, I seemed even easier, less reactive, less demanding. And that's what fooled everyone. Because when silence is chosen, it stops being passive. It becomes diagnostic. I started noticing how often my absence of input was interpreted as agreement. How quickly decisions moved forward without me once there was no resistance. How little curiosity there was about my inner world once I stopped offering it freely. No one asked why I'd gone quieter. They just adjusted to the convenience. That told me something important. My voice had been valued for its function, not its perspective. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become cold. I stayed present, but differently. I watched. I documented mentally. I observed patterns in the way I would at work when something subtle was failing. What I noticed wasn't cruelty, it was an assumption. Assumption that I would adapt. Assumption that I would be fine. Assumption that stability was guaranteed. That assumption gave me room. I began using my silence to think, not endure. I revisited old conversations with new clarity. I looked at how often compromise flowed in one direction. How often we really meant you. How often my calm had been used as proof that everything was okay. And I asked myself a hard question. If I stopped performing this role, what would actually remain? The answer wasn't comforting, but it was honest. I also noticed something else, something unexpected. The less I intervened, the more visible the imbalance became. Without my quiet corrections, things didn't run as smoothly. Small cracks appeared. Not catastrophes. Friction, misalignment, stress that used to disappear because I absorbed it. And still, no one connected that to me. They just felt vaguely unsettled. That was the moment I understood the power I'd been carrying unconsciously. Not dominance, not control. Stability. And stability, once removed, reveals the truth of a system. I didn't announce a change. I didn't demand attention. I let reality speak for itself. Silence, used this way, isn't weakness. It's restraint. It's refusing to intervene, so the truth can surface. And the truth was this. The life we were living required me to be invisible to function. That's not partnership. That's infrastructure. I didn't know yet what I would do with that knowledge, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again confuse being quiet with being powerless. While everything on the surface stayed the same, something underneath began to move. Quietly, methodically. This is the part people misunderstand when they hear stories like this. They imagine preparation as scheming, as plotting, as something fueled by resentment. It wasn't. What I was doing felt closer to accounting than revenge. Inventory, assessment, clarity. I started paying attention to facts instead of feelings. Not in a cold way, but in an honest one. I looked at how money moved. Not just income and expenses, but responsibility. Who planned? Who decided? Who assumed continuity without checking consent? I noticed how often I'd been the stabilizing force in moments no one remembered because they never escalated. I began documenting, not because I planned to use anything against anyone, but because I needed to see patterns clearly without memory softening them. Dates, conversations, decisions made unilaterally, moments where I'd been informed rather than included. Nothing dramatic, but consistency is louder than drama. I also started investing in myself in ways that didn't announce themselves. I refreshed professional certifications I'd let lapse because things were stable. I reconnected quietly with contacts I hadn't needed in years. I updated documents I'd assumed wouldn't be relevant anytime soon. Not because I planned to leave, because I stopped assuming I wouldn't have to. That distinction matters. People think preparedness means disloyalty. It doesn't. It means realism. And realism, I'd learned, had been missing from my marriage for a long time. What no one noticed, what she didn't notice, what friends didn't notice, was how much of my energy had been going into maintenance, emotional buffering, logistical smoothing, future-proofing. When I redirected even a fraction of that inward, things changed fast. I slept better, thought clearer, felt solid, not hopeful, not optimistic, grounded. I also stopped explaining myself. When plans were made without me, I didn't rush to adapt. I asked neutral questions. Sometimes I simply said, "I'll think about that," and meant it. That phrase alone created micro pauses in a system used to my immediate compliance. No one challenged it, they just looked momentarily confused. That confusion told me everything. It meant my predictability had been doing a lot of invisible work. I wasn't angry, I wasn't vindictive. I was precise, and precision is unsettling to people who rely on assumptions. I also started preparing emotionally, not by detaching, but by strengthening. I let go of the idea that being chosen meant being kept. I stopped equating longevity with security. The hardest realization was this: if I disappeared tomorrow, the system would wobble, but it would adapt. And so would she. That didn't make me bitter. It made me honest. What they never noticed wasn't that I was pulling away. It was that I had finally stopped holding everything together by default. And once you stop doing that, the future stops being hypothetical. It becomes a set of options. Clear, real, waiting. The reveal didn't come from a confession or a confrontation. It came from alignment. One evening, long after the house had gone quiet, I sat at the dining table with my notebook open, not to write, but to look. Pages of observations, timelines, financial outlines, notes I'd taken without knowing exactly what they would amount to. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. The leverage wasn't a secret. It wasn't hidden wrongdoing or some dramatic betrayal. It was something far less theatrical and far more decisive. I was the axis. Emotionally, logistically, financially, I had been the stabilizing force. Not in a way that made me indispensable forever, but in a way that meant I understood the structure better than anyone else. I knew how things actually worked. I knew which systems depended on my quiet intervention. I knew which assumptions were being made without verification. And most importantly, I knew what would happen if I simply stopped compensating. That realization didn't bring satisfaction, it brought stillness. Because leverage, when seen clearly, isn't exciting. It's sobering. It removes fantasy. It replaces hope with math. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't powerless. I had just been choosing not to see. I also saw something else that night, something harder to accept. She didn't stay because she chose me every day. She stayed because the life worked, and I had helped make it work by never asking what it cost me. That truth hurt, but it also freed me. Because once you stop believing a story, you stop acting in service of it. The leverage wasn't about winning, it was about options. I could speak up and force renegotiation. I could continue silently and preserve my appearance. Or I could prepare for an ending that hadn't been acknowledged yet, but already existed. Seeing those options clearly changed how I moved. I didn't feel urgency, I felt patience. I understood that nothing needed to happen immediately. The power wasn't in action, it was in readiness. That night, I closed the notebook and went to bed without answers. But for the first time in a long time, I slept without tension. Because clarity does that. It doesn't give you joy, it gives you ground. Clarity doesn't demand action right away. It waits. For weeks after that night, I lived inside a strange calm. Nothing on the surface changed. We still shared meals, still discussed logistics, still moved through routines that looked, from the outside, like stability. But internally, I was no longer undecided. I was evaluating. Every interaction became data, not emotionally, but structurally. I watched how often I was included by default versus by intention. I noticed how rarely curiosity moved in my direction. I paid attention to how quickly my hesitation created discomfort, and how quickly that discomfort was smoothed over without resolution. I tested nothing. I provoked nothing. I simply stopped rescuing the dynamic. That's when the options clarified themselves. Option 1 was the familiar one. Speak up, renegotiate, ask to be seen again. Try to reinsert myself into a system that had already learned how to function without my presence as a person, only my utility. That option required something specific from her, awareness. Not guilt, not an apology, awareness. And the evidence told me that awareness was unlikely, not because she was cruel, but because the system worked too well for her as it was. Option 2 was to continue as I had been. Quiet, reliable, necessary, but unseen. Preserve life, preserve the image, accept the cost privately. That option required something from me, disappearance. And then there was the third option, the one I hadn't allowed myself to consider until now. To leave, not dramatically, not angrily, not as a reaction, but as a conclusion. Not because I was mistreated in obvious ways, not because there was a single unforgivable act, but because I finally understood that staying meant consenting to erasure. That option didn't feel empowering. It felt final. I wrestled with it longer than I want to admit, not because I doubted the logic, but because I doubted my right to choose myself without permission. Years of being the steady one don't dissolve overnight. They argue back. They ask whether you're overreacting, whether you're being selfish, whether this is just what adulthood looks like. But each time I replayed the future, 5 years, 10 years, I saw the same thing. More silence, more adaptation, less self. The decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive in a surge of confidence. It arrived as a quiet sentence I said to myself one morning while tying my shoes. If nothing changes, this is my life. And I knew, with certainty, that I could not live it honestly anymore. That's when the decision was made. Not to confront, not to threaten, not to demand, but to move in a way that did not require agreement. Some choices can be negotiated. Others are simply taken. And once I crossed that internal line, there was no going back. Not because I wouldn't allow it, but because I finally understood the cost of staying. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. That surprises people. They expect panic, chaos, late-night arguments. But when a choice is clear, noise becomes unnecessary. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't change my tone or withdraw affection in ways that would trigger suspicion. On the surface, I remained exactly who I'd always been. That was the point. I began handling things the way I handle complex problems at work, sequentially, quietly, without emotional leakage. First, I separated information from emotion. I reviewed finances not with resentment, but with precision. Accounts, obligations, timelines. I noted what was shared, what was individual, and what assumptions had been made without explicit agreement. I didn't move money. I didn't hide anything. I just made sure I understood reality instead of the story I'd been telling myself. Then I handled logistics. I updated documents that hadn't been touched in years. Contacted professionals discreetly, not to escalate, but to understand. I asked questions framed around possibility, not intent. What options existed? What processes would look like if they ever became necessary? No one noticed. Why would they? I'd always handled things responsibly. This looked like more of the same. Emotionally, I did something harder. I stopped futurecasting us. I didn't imagine trips months ahead. Didn't anchor plans to shared assumptions. I lived in the present without attaching it to permanence. That created a strange freedom. I wasn't cold. I wasn't distant. I was accurate. And accuracy feels like indifference to people used to accommodation. I noticed subtle shifts in her behavior. Mild irritation when I didn't immediately align. Brief confusion when I didn't preemptively adjust. But it passed quickly because there was nothing overt to confront. That's the thing about moving in silence. It doesn't provoke resistance. It bypasses it. Internally, though, everything was changing. I was no longer organizing my life around not being a problem. I was organizing it around coherence, making sure my actions matched what I now understood to be true. And the truth was simple. The marriage existed as long as I kept compensating. So I stopped compensating. Not loudly, not bitterly, just completely. What I didn't know yet was how quickly a system reveals its fragility once the invisible support beam steps away, and how disorienting that feels for the people who never realized it was there. The first signs weren't dramatic. They were subtle, missed connections, minor frictions, small inconveniences that used to resolve themselves without anyone noticing how. Plans overlapped, assumptions misfired, stress lingered instead of dissolving. She started expressing frustration, but it was unfocused, directed at circumstances, at the time, at everything feels harder lately. I listened. I didn't rush to fix it. That alone changed the atmosphere. Conversations slowed. Pauses stretched longer. She began asking questions she hadn't asked in years. Not about my feelings, but about logistics. About whether I'd handled something. About whether I was going to take care of something she'd assumed was already done. Each time I answered honestly. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it was no. Sometimes it was, I didn't realize that was mine to handle. None of those responses was confrontational, but they introduced friction into a system that had relied on my automatic compliance. And friction feels like loss before it feels like understanding. She became restless, slightly anxious, noticing instability without identifying its source. The life she'd grown accustomed to no longer ran as smoothly, and she couldn't quite see why. Friends commented casually that we seemed off, not unhappy, just misaligned. I didn't correct them. I also didn't explain, because the explanation would have shifted focus to intent when the issue was structure. The hardest part was watching confusion turn into irritation. She wasn't angry at me, she was unsettled by the absence of something she'd never acknowledged. The emotional cushioning, the quiet adjustments, the invisible labor, and because she'd never seen it, she couldn't name its absence. That's when the questions started. Are you okay? You've been quiet lately. Did I do something? Those questions didn't come from curiosity, they came from discomfort. I answered truthfully, but minimally. I'm fine. I've just been thinking. No, nothing specific. All of that was true. But truth without context can feel evasive, and that made her uneasy. What she didn't know was that the consequences weren't something I was causing. They were something I had stopped preventing. And once prevention ends, systems reveal their cracks quickly, not with explosions, with strain. By the time panic appears, the window has usually closed. It didn't show up as fear at first. It showed up as urgency disguised as concern. She started trying, subtly at first, to reconnect, asking about my day in ways that felt newly intentional, suggesting time together that hadn't been planned weeks in advance, bringing up memories from earlier years when things felt lighter. On the surface, it looked like an effort, but timing matters. What I felt wasn't relief, it was recognition too late, because the shift hadn't been triggered by a misunderstanding. It had been triggered by clarity, and clarity doesn't reverse just because attention finally arrives. I could see the recalibration happening in real time, the way she leaned in slightly when I didn't automatically align, the way her tone softened when my responses stayed neutral, the way she seemed to sense, without naming it, that something essential was no longer guaranteed. But what she was responding to wasn't me, it was instability. That's a painful distinction to make, because when effort comes only after consequences appear, it doesn't feel like a choice, it feels like preservation. She asked one evening, carefully, "Do you still want this?" It wasn't an invitation, it was a test. And for the first time, I didn't rush to reassure. I paused, long enough for the silence to register. "I want honesty," I said, "and alignment." She nodded quickly, too quickly. "We can work on that," she said. "But working on something requires acknowledging that it exists." And we weren't there. What she wanted was restoration, a return to the version of me who absorbed, adapted, stabilized. What I needed was recognition of who I was, not what I provided. Those two needs no longer overlapped. The hardest part wasn't the tension. It was the grief of realizing that the moment where repair might have worked had passed quietly, without anyone noticing. Repair requires awareness before detachment, not after. And I had already detached, not emotionally, but structurally. I had stopped organizing my life around saving something that only existed if I disappeared inside it. So when she tried to fix it, there was nothing to fix in the way she understood. The system had changed. And systems don't revert because someone finally notices the strain. They either adapt honestly or they end. The conversation happened on a Tuesday. No symbolism, no heightened emotion, just an evening like any other. She asked if we could talk. Her voice was careful, controlled in the way people get when they sense the ground has shifted under them. We sat across from each other, no phones, no distractions. She spoke first. "I feel like you're already gone," she said, not accusing, observing. I nodded. That alone startled her, not because I agreed, but because I didn't deny it. "I'm still here," I said calmly, "but I'm not holding everything together anymore." She frowned slightly, trying to locate the argument she was supposed to respond to. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I stopped assuming we were aligned," I said, "and started paying attention to whether we actually were." There was no anger in my voice, no list of grievances, no emotional surge. That made it harder for her. She asked when this started. I told her the truth, not a date, but a pattern, not a moment, but a realization. She wanted specifics, incidents, proof. I didn't give them, because this wasn't about blame, it was about structure. "I didn't feel chosen," I said simply. "I felt used for stability." She reacted, not defensively but with disbelief. "That was never my intention." "I know," I said. "That's why it took me so long to see." Silence followed, heavy, but not hostile. She asked if this could be fixed. That was the question she'd been holding back. I answered honestly, only if we both acknowledge that what we had depended on me being smaller than I am. She didn't respond right away, because that wasn't something she could accept without losing the life she'd been living. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't demand change. I didn't issue ultimatums. I told her what I was no longer willing to be, and in doing so, I made the outcome inevitable. The conversation ended quietly, no shouting, no tears, just two people realizing they no longer occupied the same future. When it was over, I felt something unexpected, not relief, finality. After the conversation, there was no dramatic fallout. No slammed doors, no frantic phone calls, no late-night attempts to renegotiate the past. What followed was something far quieter and far more revealing. Life didn't collapse, it simplified. The days that came after felt stripped down, almost clinical. Paperwork, logistics, conversations that were polite, contained, and emotionally restrained. Two adults moving through the practical consequences of a truth that had already been accepted internally, even if it hadn't been spoken out loud for years. That alone told me I'd made the right decision, because when a relationship ends, and the primary emotion is clarity, not chaos, it means the ending happened long before the words. What I felt first wasn't freedom, it was alignment. For the first time in a long time, my internal state matched my external life. There was no longer a gap between who I was pretending to be and who I actually was. No more emotional bookkeeping. No more quiet resentment disguised as patience. I didn't wake up lighter. I woke up honest. Grief came later, but it was clean grief. The kind that doesn't rot inside you. I mourned the version of the future I'd assumed was inevitable. The years I'd invested under the belief that consistency alone could sustain intimacy. The part of myself that thought endurance was the same as devotion. But I didn't regret my decision. That's an important distinction, because regret feels like wanting to go back. And I never wanted to go back. What surprised me most was how my body responded. My shoulders relaxed without effort. My sleep deepened. The constant low-level tension I'd normalized for years simply vanished. Not replaced by happiness, replaced by quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't empty but spacious. I started noticing how much of my identity had been shaped around being the one who holds things together. How often my self-worth had been tied to being needed, relied upon, and deferred to only when something went wrong. Without that role, I had to answer a new question. Who am I when I'm not stabilizing someone else's life? At first, the answer was uncomfortable. I realized how rarely I'd asked myself what I wanted without immediately filtering it through practicality or impact. How often I'd delayed my own desires because they weren't urgent, or because someone else's needs felt louder. So I slowed down. I didn't rush to redefine myself. I didn't reinvent my life. I didn't fill the space with distractions or new attachments. I let the space exist. And in that space, something important happened. My sense of self stopped being reactive. I wasn't responding to tension anymore. I wasn't managing anyone else's emotional state. I wasn't preemptively adjusting to avoid friction. That absence of constant calibration changed how I moved through the world. At work, I noticed I spoke less, but with more precision. I no longer volunteered to absorb problems by default. I asked better questions. I let responsibility land where it belonged, instead of intercepting it out of habit. Some people appreciated that, some didn't. And for the first time, that distinction didn't threaten me. In relationships, friendships, family, new connections, I became more selective, not colder, clearer. I stopped offering access before trust, stopped overfunctioning to earn closeness, stopped mistaking availability for intimacy. People experience me differently now. Some said I seemed more grounded, others said I felt distant, a few drifted away entirely. That didn't hurt the way it once would have, because I finally understood something fundamental. Not everyone benefits when you stop disappearing, and that's not your problem to solve. The biggest shift, though, was internal. I no longer confuse silence with virtue. When I'm quiet now, it's because I'm choosing not to speak, not because I'm afraid of being inconvenient. When I disagree, I don't soften it into invisibility. When something matters to me, I say so early, calmly, without apology or escalation. That doesn't make me louder. It makes me legible. And being legible filters your life in ways you can't fully anticipate. The version of me who stayed too long wasn't weak. He was loyal, without boundaries. He believed love meant minimizing himself for the sake of stability. He thought being indispensable required being unobtrusive. I don't judge that version of myself. He did what he knew how to do, but I don't live there anymore. Now, I understand that true stability doesn't come from one person compensating endlessly. It comes from mutual awareness, from shared responsibility, from both people being fully present, not one person holding the weight while the other moves freely. I also understand that being chosen isn't something that happens once. It's something that's demonstrated continuously. And if you're only chosen when you're convenient, when you're easy, when you're silent, then you're not being chosen at all. You're being used for continuity. I don't carry bitterness. That's important. Bitterness keeps you tied to the very thing you claim to have left. It's just an attachment in a different costume. What I carry instead is discernment. I know what it feels like to be slowly erased. I know what it costs to stay quiet for too long. And I know now that peace built on self-erasure is not peace. It's postponement. Who I am now isn't dramatic. I don't dominate rooms. I don't have confidence. I don't need to prove that I've changed. I move deliberately. I speak when it matters. I walk away when alignment is absent. That's not power over others. That's power over self-abandonment. And once you have that, you never mistake endurance for love again. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to extract a clean rule, something sharp, something quotable, something that turns lived experience into a warning label. But real endings don't resolve that neatly. What stayed with me wasn't a lesson about marriage, or women, or commitment. It was a realization about assumptions, and how quietly destructive they are when left unexamined. I assumed love was cumulative. I assumed consistency guaranteed security. I assumed that if I stayed calm, useful, and reliable, the relationship would naturally protect itself. That was my arrogance. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that believes not being challenged means being valued. The kind that mistakes endurance for depth. The kind that builds an entire life on the idea that nothing bad is happening, without ever asking whether something good still is. I didn't lose my marriage overnight. I lost it slowly by treating it like something guaranteed. And the truth is, nothing meaningful survives on autopilot. Not love, not respect, not intimacy. They require attention, friction, and sometimes discomfort. They require two people who are both willing to be fully present, not one person shrinking so the other can remain comfortable. For a long time, I thought quiet dominance meant control. It doesn't. Quiet dominance is self-respect without announcement. It's restraint without resentment. It's the ability to walk away without needing the other person to agree that you're right. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't demand apologies or rewrite the past. I simply stopped participating in my own erasure. And when I did, the structure that depended on that erasure ended on its own, cleanly, inevitably, without drama. That's the part people rarely talk about. When you stop disappearing, some relationships don't fight to keep you. They simply can't exist anymore. And that doesn't make them evil. It makes them honest. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this. If your peace depends on your silence, if your stability depends on you being smaller, if your love requires you to be endlessly understanding but rarely understood, then the problem isn't that you haven't endured enough. It's that you've endured too much. I'm not telling this story to tell you what to do, only to invite you to look, honestly, at where you might be confusing comfort with connection and loyalty with self-erasure. So I'll leave you with one question. Not rhetorical, not dramatic, just real. In your own life, where are you staying silent not because you're at peace, but because you're afraid of what choosing yourself might change? If this resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not judgment, not advice, just reflection. Because sometimes the most powerful shifts don't happen when we speak louder. They happen when we finally stop disappearing.